Welcome back to the Skift Ideas Podcast. Today, Colin is joined by Mark Vanhoenacker, a commercial pilot for British Airways and the best-selling author of Skyfaring, A Journey with a Pilot, How to Land a Plane, and Imagine a City. With Mark's extensive experience and first-hand insights into the realm of aviation, Colin and Mark will explore some of the more poetic and ethereal experiences from 35,000 feet above the ground, to the worldview that Mark has from connecting with people and cities globally. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Skift Ideas Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Colin Nagy, and we have a very exciting episode for you today. I'm excited to be joined by Mark Vanhoenacker. He's a commercial airline pilot for British Airways and the author of a fantastic book called Skyfaring, A Journey with a Pilot and How to Land a Plane. He's been a columnist for the Financial Times and a regular contributor to the New York Times, and also has written for the Times UK, the Atlantic, Wired, and the Los Angeles Times. Born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Mark trained as a historian and worked as a management consultant before starting his flight training in Britain in 2001. He now flies the Boeing 787 Dreamliner from London to cities around the world. Mark, we're super happy to have you with us today.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here, Colin, and I'm a huge fan of Skift, so it's a special day.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. I've been a fan of the books for a long time. So wanted to kick off, and you had a different career path kind of coming up, but just give us a little bit of the background of how you became a pilot and some of those examples of intrigue and what really piqued your interest when you were young.
So growing up in Pittsfield, that small city in western Massachusetts, I was in love with airplanes. Airplanes are the first thing I remember loving as a kid, or really capturing my interest as a kid. I had tons of model airplanes. I loved to go to air shows with my dad. I had books about planes. Every time we flew, we didn't fly all that often, but when we did, it was far more exciting to me to be on the plane than to get off it. It was just that classic, love for the window seat and the view, and I was also in love with maps as well. I had one of those illuminated globes in my room and an atlas that I turned to, and I would read off the cities on there that were just names to me, nothing more than names, but super evocative names. Cape Town for one, Hong Kong, Sydney, Vancouver, Rio de Janeiro, all these places that I never thought I'd see. And so those two interests were kind of with me all through my childhood. But aviation does run in families, but it didn't really run in my family. And so I didn't. If my father or mother or another relative had been a pilot, maybe I would have come to the career much sooner than I did. Instead, I went to college and grad school. I started a PhD in history, but I never finished it. And then I decided to become an airline pilot. But in order to save money for it, I took an office job, and I went into that consulting job because I knew it was one where I'd fly a lot. So, they had that company had an office right in Boston on the waterfront with a great view of Logan Airport. So I spent most of my time either on planes or watching planes. And then a few years after that, I got onto a cadet training program just before 9/11. And that was, it's that classic tale of a dream come true, I guess. I got a lot of emails from readers who use that phrase, a dream come true, and that's still what it feels like to me. And I started on the A320 fleet at Heathrow. My first flight was actually just over 20 years ago from Heathrow to Glasgow. And then in 2007, I switched to the 747, which was the plane I dreamed of flying as a kid. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And then 5 years ago, I switched to the 787, which is what I fly now.
I loved reading about, I believe you were picking up a family member or a friend at Kennedy, and you saw, I believe it was like the Saudi like tail fin, and that was like one of your first memories of something that you didn't quite understand, and its routine going back and forth to this far-flung place was like your routine of like walking back and forth to school. So I love that early taste of kind of the world and the mysteries of it, as you were young.
Yeah, I many of your listeners who are my age or a little bit older will remember the old Pan Am Worldport, that terminal at JFK, which has been gone for years now. But I remember parking on it with my dad, and we were going to pick up a relative coming from Belgium, and just the idea of going to Kennedy for the day for a few hours to look at those planes and think, to look at those departure screens and think of the places they were coming from or going to. Was was just magical. It was absolutely magical to me.
Now, as you went into the cadet program, you know, what was that first time sort of power, being under control of an aircraft, whether that was, with an instructor or whatever? Just tell me about the feeling of that, because there's a lot of people that like flying in aviation, but then when they try their hand at the real thing, it can be a little overwhelming. So how did you talk me through that a little bit? Was it love at first experience, or was it a little overwhelming?
The a pilot's career, it has a number of firsts. So there's your first lesson, and for me, that had happened when I was 16 or 17, in Western Massachusetts, uh, and that was a flight over my hometown, from Pittsfield Airport, and that hometown plays a big role in the new book Imagine a City. But that view of my home from above, to suddenly look down on your own on your own streets, and like, oh my god, that's my high school, and that's my dad's office, and that's the school where my mom works, and oh, I know that hill, I know that road, I didn't know that road went that way. And that sense of seeing the world from above, which completely I mean, it's that that was a revelation in the early 20th century that really changed the way uh, we saw ourselves and saw ourselves as a species. And I think everyone who flies has a moment of that kind of species level wonder the first time they fly. Um, and then, the other milestones, I guess, were the first time I did a solo flight. So that was in Arizona. And again, that's a feeling you just never forget. The first time your instructor gets out of the aircraft and you head off, um, and you do your three touch and go landings, and that sense that that you've learned enough and you have enough training now to be up there safely is a really wonderful feeling, and it gives you a great sense of accomplishment. I remember my first night flight as well. I mean, one of my favorite things to see from above, even now from an airliner, is cities from above at night. And the first time I flew at night, which was also in Arizona, and to look down on a cityscape, and Arizona, the air there is so dry, and the city is so sprawling. It's like a mini Los Angeles, or not so many these days, and to suddenly rise above it and to see it stretching out like this microchip off to the hills was a major feeling. And then, of course, there's the first flights on an airliner. So my first flight obviously we spent a lot of time in the simulator training, and those simulators are as good as the aircraft for training. But nevertheless, we did have a day where we took an Airbus to France for the day, me and 5 or 6 other trainees and a couple examiners or trainers. So there were those first flights of an actual airliner, which were incredible. And then, of course, a few days later, the first ones with customers on board, where you're finally earning your keep as a pilot. So there's many levels to the way that dream can come true. And yeah, that's been my path. Do you remember your first flight? Do you remember your very first flight as a passenger? Or
I just remember I grew up in near San Francisco, and I just remember waking up very early with my family, and driving in, and at that point we were kind of like a united family. So Rhapsody in Blue, is the kind of theme song for, and
right,
just
right,
that kind of era of early 80s sort of California SFO um optimism, which was kind of what I remember. And what's actually quite poignant is we had an exchange student actually from Belgium, when I was in high school, and he was like, "I'm going to be a pilot," and everyone's kind of razzing him like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." But he went back. I believe he got most of his hours in the Belgian Air Force, and then flew for Sabina, or the national carrier now defunct. and then was with Emirates for a long time. And so my mom was kind of his rock, when he was a young Belgian kid studying in a faraway land. And so I brought my mom to Dubai on a trip, and we got to spend time with him, and it was very nice. It was a very nice kind of way to close the loop, and
Yeah,
also
excellent.
someone he kind of had this hero's journey of some doing something that's difficult, which I think was great. But switching gears a little bit to what you touched on, which is the sort of the geography and almost the poetry of seeing the world from a different vantage point. It's what I really, really loved in Skyfaring is that it kind of makes the hairs stand up on my arm thinking about some of those passages, because you very evocatively write about flying through the air at night, and almost these comforting things, these familiar things were what you describe as waypoints. And I would love for you to just kind of talk about the passage over unfamiliar or familiar terrain and the kind of feelings that evokes for you.
Yeah, so one of the things I really tried to get across in Skyfaring was how there is a world above the world that pilots move through, and that is mapped and controlled and regulated, and that it has it has place names in it that are uh, very much like any landscape that you would get to know personally or professionally down on the earth. And so one of the major ways in which the sky is divided is into these things called flight information regions, and they are these kind of countries of the sky. And there's 6 or 7. In Northwest Europe, there's I don't know how many there are in the U.S., 10 or 14 or something like that, and they have names usually they're named for cities. So they have this there's this quality of when you're coming back across Europe to London, and the last Dutch controller says to you, contact now London, and you call the city. I mean, you literally use the city's name to speak to the next controller as you move into London's airspace, and then of course many of those cities have far more evocative names, even at least for someone from my part of the world. You fly over Samarkand or Dushanbe, or you talk to Lahore or Delhi, as I just did on my last trip. And so you have this sense of cities kind of casting these shadows up into the sky and defining the sky above them in a way which it was very unexpected to me when I became a pilot. And then there are waypoints, which are these 5-letter coded positions in the sky. You could think of one called Logan or Tulip, or they have all sorts of names. Often they're named for sports figures in that city, or for tourist attractions or something like that. And often they're just completely random. They want them to be easily pronounceable to whatever your first language. And so an airway that you might take you from London to Cape Town, for example, there's probably a whole series of airways that you'd move from one to the other as you went. And they will be marked out along these waypoints, which form a kind of wayfinding in the sky, a kind of signposting, and a measure of your progress. Often, air traffic control might ask you to report at a certain waypoint, and you would tell them, yeah, we're just passing this waypoint at this altitude. And so the sense that the sky above is filled with its own geography, which next time you're just walking in a field outside your home, or you could look up and just try to imagine the lines and the places there that exist virtually, but quite importantly for the pilots whose job it is to fly through the skies.
I think there's also something very interesting about it's very spiritual experience. You're kind of flying through the air at night, yet the communication with these different cities as you're flying over is so matter of fact. So there's no wasted words as you're talking to these people. So you're having this very emotional experience transcending space and time, but you're having a very transactional conversation on the ground, right?
Yeah, and the language of flying is something I've written a few articles about, and its compactness has its own kind of poetry to it. There's no fat on it at all, as you say, and therefore, and if you're inclined to sort of minimalism, then the simpler it is, the more evocative or the more poetic it can be. And certainly, aviation in general, I think combines sort of technical prowess or engineering qualities of efficiency and compactness, and with our oldest dream of taking flight, and that the interplay between the scientific and the romantic is something that I really wanted to capture in Skyfaring and in Imagine the City as well. But I think it's not often appreciated how much kind of romance there still is to the job. And that doesn't come into the actual job. I mean, it's not a part of anything we do formally, and yet I do think it's an attraction to the job for many people.
I also think that what I love about your writing is you're still in love, right? Sometimes as I'm walking through, um, an American city airport, I see a very beleaguered American Airlines pilot or United captain, and these guys have been running hard for a long time. There's not a lot of healthy things to eat. They're in this kind of like um, liminal space, and I just feel like it has to be a little taxing on the body and the soul, which I'm sure it is for you at times. But it feels like that there still is a love for both the poetic and, as you write in your latest book, Imagine a City, the exploration that it affords, and like the expansiveness that you kind of get to see.
Yeah, I one of the reasons I've enjoyed writing about flying is that even for me, with perhaps a slightly romantic tendency to when it comes to thinking about my job, even for me, after a certain number of years, you start to get accustomed to things. I mean, I've seen the Northern Lights. I mean, every winter I see them dozens of times. And when I have some friends, they're going to, we're going to Norway or somewhere, Alaska, to go see the Northern Lights, and you think these people are making a journey of a lifetime to see something I see basically on most night flights in the winter, not all, but most. And you start to get used to that, and I wanted to not get used to it. And writing about it, trying to share my enthusiasm for it, and in particular trying to describe it, is something that feels a little bit like a mission to me, both because it helps me engage with readers, but also because it maintains my own my own interest in it as time goes on, and it reminds me that these things are unique. And I just saw a tweet by an American journalist who was on a flight somewhere, and he was lamenting that on a transcontinental flight there were only two or three people who had the window blinds open on a day flight, and people have screens, of course. There's so much, they have work to do, of course. People want to sleep, but I do want to remind people that if they do want to look outside, or at least think about about the activity of flying, that it's reliably full of wonder. I think I would say.
There's a great book that I'm sure has come across your radar. Alain de Botton wrote that book called A Week at the Airport, and he managed to find this. He was basically embedded at Heathrow for a week, and he's such a wonderful writer and observer and a philosopher, and was able to find so much beauty and so much interpersonal stories, just kind of being an observer at the arrivals area of the airport, and which seems like it could be a fairly trite conceit, but he managed to really pull out some like beautiful threads with it in a nice way. And what I wanted to also talk to you about is for a long time before you moved to the 787 Dreamliner, you were flying on the 747, and going back to Pan Am and going back to a lot of the kind of days of the jet set, the beginning of the ability to kind of traverse the world, this particular aircraft played a huge role. So I would love to know a little bit about your relationship to the 747, both as a pilot, perhaps aesthetically, what it feels like to fly, and also just about your emotional connection to the history with the aircraft.
Well, yeah. First of all, I'm a huge fan of Alain de Botton and his writing, and he's been a big supporter of my own writing, actually. As for the 747, it was, one of my friends that I did my training with. When she was growing up, she didn't want to become a pilot. She wanted to become a 747 pilot. Like, it was that specific for her as a child. And I didn't. For me, it wasn't um, quite that powerful a force, but nevertheless, it was the plane that I loved and that I recognized. Most of the models, or the models I like best that I made, let's say, were of 747s. The first flight I can remember. It was not the first flight I can remember, but the most meaningful early flight I took as a passenger was on a 747 to a KLM flight to Amsterdam when I was 14. And you know, I think because I was going by myself, and I was far more interested in the experience, and it was a sort of heightened experience, literally, because I was without my parents. And I remember seeing that beautiful blue plane, in those great colors, uh, parked at JFK, and stepping onto that just felt extraordinary. And of course, the plane, it really changed. It changed the world. It shrank the world in a way that computers do as well, of course. But the 747 made it possible for long haul travel to be a sort of middle class ambition, which it had never been before. And of course, it's entered the culture in all sorts of ways. Like, the Joni Mitchell has that song where she says, I dreamed of 747s over geometric farms. Um, and I once was at an exercise class. I think it was in Vancouver, at our hotel in Vancouver, and at one point the instructor was saying, I think we were like lying on the floor, and she said, wanted us to lift our arms and legs up, and she's like, lift them up like a 747 taking off. And I love the A320, but nobody's ever going to say that about an A320, I think. And Norman Foster called it the 20th century building he admired the most. And it was just the shape of it. It was so bird-like. Lifting the flight deck onto another deck was designed for cargo. I mean, it was designed to make it possible to load load cargo through the nose, because they thought that the future was going to be supersonic travel. So that shape was, a pure engineering solution, and yet to me, it made the aircraft, a unique in terms of how it looked, and B, quite bird-like. It looks like the head of a bird to me. It still does. So I loved it. And if you must have had some amazing 747 experiences yourself over the years.
I just remember flying uh, when Cathay had them, on the upper deck, and then obviously on BA 747s on that little um, upper deck where it just feels very private. It feels like you're completely like on another plane, and for me, just the aesthetic of it. I mean, obviously, there's the enduring symbol of Air Force One, and the colors of that, and the way it looks, on a tarmac. But there's just something about the aesthetic, but also the emotional role of the plane, as you said, kind of kickstarting this new ability for us to traverse the world, and thus it's not just aviation nerds that are obsessed with it. I think that it kind of has transcended a lot of other things, and kind of captured a lot of hearts as well. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and today we can get a glimpse of practically any city in the world through our phones, through Instagram. But you've explored the question quite often: has the city changed, or have I? Which I really like, because when you have a geographical cadence or recurring cadence with the city, you notice its evolutions. What city has surprised you? You know, coming back or evolving. For me, I would say Singapore, given the kind of recent geopolitical realignments of the world, the pace of development that's happening on a very small, stretch of um, island-based city state. But are there any cities that you've been frequenting that the evolution or devolution has surprised you?
I think from a purely visuals, and I mean, obviously we approach cities from the sky, so the way they look from above is their first impression for us, as it is for many passengers. And the kind of explosion in skyscrapers all over the world over the last 20 years has just been really striking. I mean, in London, which I fly over multiple times a week, the new skyscrapers in the city and and down along the South Bank have just been, I kind of lose track of what they are now. I think, oh, what is that? What, has that been there for a while? And then, of course, Dubai and Miami both have had, really striking skyscraper booms. But I think maybe the best answer to your question is probably around Delhi. So when I first went to Delhi, they had just begun building a metro. And since then, it's been developing very, very quickly. It's a really I'm not just an airplane geek. I'm also a bit of a sort of general transportation geek, and so I really noticed the transport in the city and how easy it is to use, and how just how nice it is, basically, I guess, and how convenient. And Delhi's system is marvelous, and for people who are traveling to a city the size of Delhi, it's now one of the largest cities in the world. It is not an easy place to find your way around at street level, and it's cacophonous and often warm, and it's an exciting place, but it's not necessarily the easiest place to get around. And I've have been really struck by how much that's changed as the metro has been developed there, and how much freer even I, someone who's been there dozens of times, how much more likely I am to go to a distant part of the city because I can get there on the metro, and to watch one of the largest cities on earth kind of construct that almost before my eyes has been a revelation and a joy. I was just in Delhi last week, or 2 days ago, in fact, and was again struck by how nice it is. And every city should have a metro as nice as Delhi is, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was actually quite impressed with the transport that they put into Doha, for the World Cup, like the actual underground or MTR or subway. I forget what they're calling it. They did a shockingly good job with that, and it actually did an amazing job during the World Cup, kind of getting people from stadium to stadium. But going back to Dubai, that's a great point. I saw a time lapse video the other day of there's an old white sort of Toyota building, which was one of the first sort of like executive offices in Dubai, I believe on Sheikh Zayed Road, and it just basically had a time lapse of that, and
I would
that
love to see
is
that.
I should find it for you because it's unbelievable, and what a pace of growth there, and it's also, for my money, probably one of the more spectacle types of places to fly over, as you're coming in, because you have the man-made islands, you have the Burj, etc. One of the most surreal trips that I took is at one point, I I hadn't really, this was like in the early 2000s, maybe. I hadn't spent a ton of time in the Middle East, and I had to go on a business trip from I think I was in Munich, and I needed to get to Seoul, and the team was like, "Oh, here's your options to fly," and one of them was like, whatever, Aeroflot or something. It was like pass, and I flew Etihad, and I remember just like flying in to Abu Dhabi, in that you know amazing color of the water. You see some of the man-made islands that Gursky that has famously kind of photographed, and just feeling very otherworldly, in the connection. And at that point, still Abu Dhabi hasn't opened up their new airport yet, and it still is that old, weird, kind of older airport. But what an amazing kind of cross section, and that's what I really love about these Middle Eastern airports is they're such an incredible cross section of so many different cultural operating systems, right? And I always get a kick out of, I believe it's Terminal 2 in Dubai, because you have, guys flying into Kabul, you have kind of Russian Orthodox over here, you have all sorts of different sort of tribal characters, you have people flying to Tbilisi. It's like I've always wanted a street style photographer to post up in that particular terminal for some time. But what I wanted to ask you is, with airports, as a frequent user, and I've always liked how Tyler Boulay at Monocle talks about like the department of first impressions as you're kind of arriving somewhere. What are the airports that you really like, from a feeling level, a visual level, or just a general, pragmatic level?
I would say that there are some airports we go to where, um, just on a pragmatic level, where, I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, Seychelles, for example, where, um, you know, you can walk through the airport in about 3 minutes, and that just means you get to your bed faster. Or when you come back to the airport, you get to the aircraft in just a few minutes. So small airports do have that going for them, but I think the direction of your question is more about the sort of feel of great as in large airports, and I guess the new airport in Beijing, Dajing, which opened 4 or 5 years ago. I guess I wrote about it for the Financial Times actually, and it was just the halls of the interior halls of it, the arrival halls of it are extraordinary, and it's a cathedral to planes really, and which is saying something given the capital airport, the one that was opened for the Olympics, is itself one of the more striking airports you'll go to. I love Vancouver's airport. It's very, very calm. They have like a big water feature in the arrivals hall, which is and I think water is one of those things that just naturally relaxes people. I think they have an aquarium as well. Um, I will actually say, unbelievably, perhaps I went to LaGuardia recently, and I was really, really impressed with it. They've put in a ton of money there, and it was a real joy to see New York having an airport that's been changed that much. And Boston, the other one to mention is Boston Logan. They're building a new international terminal which hasn't opened yet, but it's going to open later this year. And I've seen it. I fly to Boston all the time, and I've been watching it rise. And it's red. It has this very striking color as opposed to just being a box of marble and glass and steel. It has a bright red color, and I can't wait to get inside it. So stay tuned.
For me, there's just something about Hong Kong. Um, I believe it was Norman Foster, but there's something about the use of the light. There's something about how like the sort of tail fins of aircraft are like framed beautifully amongst these very verdant hills. And there's also just something about that airport that doesn't feel kind of claustrophobic, right? There's other airports like Hamad and Doha that almost have a casino-like feeling where they're actually, you don't know if it's day or night, kind of by
Yeah,
design.
yeah, yeah.
But there's something to me that I'll always love about Hong Kong, and also I think that they've just been so inspired with Cathay has been very inspired about the designers that they've always worked with some of the lounges. Like I found out a few years ago that John Pawson, the designer, did their first lounge there, which has now been redone by Ilsa Crawford. But just that standard of knowing the designers that can interface well with that Foster vibe. And there's just something about it. And also, I was talking the other day about I love that passengers can check in with all their bags like in town and then just get
Yeah,
on
yeah.
the
That
plane.
that used that
And
used to be more of a thing, right? They had that in Tokyo for a while, and even at Paddington for a while. I don't know.
Yeah.
to that. Yeah.
It might be a security thing or it might be a COVID thing. But I know that Dubai just Emirates opened a in-town check-in at DIFC so people can like drop their bags. But yeah, I just like when a lot of these airports are just trying to make themselves more efficient and make it easier for kind of tourists to get in, for business travelers to get in. And I do think that there's a big point to this, like, department of first impressions, right? If you're an investor coming to spend money in a place, it's like, how are you treated, as you're getting off that 787. I wanted to talk about two more topics because I know you have much to accomplish today other than just talking to us. But I wanted to talk about future pilots, right? So, what is it like becoming a pilot today? There's some labor shortages. Like, what do companies need to be thinking about? What advice would you give to a future pilot?
That's a good question. So, I think worldwide there is the pilot shortage. I think that's something I read about all the time. And so, for that reason alone, that would suggest it's a good career. I get a lot of emails from people who are um, in their, let's say, late 20s to late 30s who wanted to become a pilot when they were a kid. They didn't do it, and now they're quite far along into another career. Often they're very successful, lawyers, accountants, that kind of thing, and they want to know whether it's still possible. So I would say to them that yes, it is possible, and I was 29 when I started flying, and that was when the retirement age was 55. So now it's 65. So that's equivalent to starting at 39. And I would also say to younger people, I don't really know any pilots who don't like their job, and that's quite a thing to be able to say. I have friends who work in all sorts of fields, and in finance, and in healthcare, and they all would say on the one hand this, on the other hand that, about their jobs, and sometimes the other hand is the dominant one. And I don't really know of another job that people seem to enjoy so much, and I think that says something, right? I mean, that's if I had heard that earlier, I might have gone into it even earlier than I did. And then there are also just some preconceptions about first of all, you don't need to have 20/20 vision. You're allowed to wear glasses within limits, and and you can do it. You don't need to do it at 20 either. You can do it at 30 or 35 or even older. And yeah, that would be my main points of advice. And of course, if you're a young person still in school, you're going to need some math, or some maths, as they say here, and some physics. Yeah, you're going to need a good record if you want to get into it.
Now you have me thinking, there's still a chance for me at age 42, but
There's definitely a chance.
I think that the physics thing could be a bit of a problem, but there's an app for that, I'm sure.
And in fact, British Airways just reopened its cadet training program this week for the first time since in a while. I mean, I went through that program in 2001, and it has just been reopened. And that will be, for those in the UK, that will be important news, I think. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I wanted to end on a more sort of expansive note. I want you to talk to us a little bit about the worldview that has been afforded to you, by this ability to travel the world, to kind of feel these feelings of moving beyond these waypoints and these conversations with strangers throughout the sky, and also the ability to kind of feel the pulse and feel the people of many places. How has it shaped you as a human being?
We see the world from above as pilots, and I just flew to Delhi, and I couldn't even begin to list the number of cities we saw at night. Scrolling past, and that cities from above at night are one of my favorite sights. They're simultaneously biological and technical. You can see how they fit into their landscape, or on a major harbor, or along a river downstream from other cities and upstream of others, and 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 of course, we see the continuity of the natural world from one place to another. You can see that if you, what are the landscapes that lie between one city and another if you're flying during the day, and that can encompass, a good portion of the planet on a long haul flight. And then, of course, we land in these cities, and we have a really unique experience of them, which I really tried to get across in the new book, which is, when I was a business traveler, you would land and you would go straight to work, and you'd be in a hotel, and then you'd have meetings throughout the day, and then dinners with clients or customers, and then you'd go and do it again the next day, and maybe go to another city, and it was kind of easy to forget where you were, and hard to really take in the place you were in. And then, of course, if you go to a city as a tourist, which I still do, of course, as a personal traveler, you have a bucket list of sites. You think, so many people are coming to Europe from the U.S. this summer. You might be going to Paris, and you might reasonably think this is the trip of a lifetime. I may never be in Paris again, or Istanbul again, and so you want to do everything you can in that time. And I'm just like many other people. I can tire myself out and kind of stop enjoying it, or stop realizing where I am, or the scale of the journey, that I've made a journey in a few hours that would have been all but impossible for most of human history, and might have taken weeks or months until the last 200 years or so. Whereas when we go as pilots or as cabin crew, we land in a city, and we don't really have to do anything there. We are free to kind of explore it, and we don't have meetings, and we also know that we're going to come back again and again. The first time I went to Beijing, some of my colleagues were going to go up to the Great Wall, and I'd never been to Beijing, or I'd never been to China, I think. And I thought, of course I want to see the Great Wall. But I knew that I was coming back to Beijing. Even on that first visit, I knew I was coming back a few weeks later. So I was able to say on the first day, I'm just gonna walk around. I'm gonna walk around and find a cafe, and walk through this park, and then along this portion of the old city wall, and just get a feel for the place in a way that's relaxed, and kind of brings out the the commonality of cities as well as their uniqueness. And that's really what I've tried to capture in my writing. And if Skyfaring was about the life in the sky, then this new book, Imagine a City, is more about the life on the ground all over the world, getting an experience of cities which is probably unique in human history, and trying to share that with readers or customers as best we can.
Well, thank you. Very well put. And I would highly recommend that everyone goes and buys Skyfaring and the newest book, which is called Imagine a City. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. We're very appreciative. We covered a lot of ground, and it was an absolute pleasure having you on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Colin. And speaking of having you on, I hope to see you on a flight someday soon.
Sounds good. I'll be there. Mark has generously sent us a passage from one of his books, which we will conclude our podcast with today. Thanks so much for listening.
So this is a passage from the introduction to Imagine a City, and I'm sitting in my hotel room in Abu Dhabi, thinking about what cities have meant to me and what my job as a pilot means to me. And in the next passage, I also mention my hometown, Pittsfield in Massachusetts, which plays a small role in this new book. Most pilots love their job and tend not to want to retire when the rules say we must. When my days and nights of flying are finished, I want to be able to remember all I can about the cities I saw. In addition, while years may remain before my retirement, I'd like to share now what I love best about many of these cities, not only with my family and friends, but with readers who might not travel as often, as far, or in as extraordinary a manner as a pilot does. And extraordinary is the right word. Long-haul airline pilots today are given an experience of cities that no one else in history has ever had. 2 decades into my career, in an age in which it often seems that the urbanized future of our civilization is taking form directly before my eyes, my experience of cities as a pilot remains a source of deep fascination to me, one that's distinct from my love for flight itself. During a single flight, we may cross above dozens of cities, most memorably after dark. On some journeys, the lights of a sleeping and apparently silent settlement beneath us, one that, if it doesn't have a major airport, we may not be able to name without consulting our navigation charts, suggest Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, passing, like night, from land to land. and the fragility and even the loneliness of what an observer arriving in our orbit might regard as only one more of the universe's strands of bioluminescence. On other flights, when I see a gathering of dim lights stitched into the far below floor of a Siberian or Nigerian or Iranian night, I'm struck instead by a sense of warmth, even intimacy, and by the possibility that I'm looking down on an evening much like the most peaceful ones of my Pittsfield childhood. Then we descend. If we do so at daybreak, the returning light allows us to see how wilderness, farmland, inhospitably steep terrain, or thousands of miles of open ocean give way to our destination. One of the largest cities in history, perhaps, which has grown through its own long centuries, and which now, on this latest of its mornings, and in the last 20 minutes of our journey, expands to fill the jet's windscreen with a map-like view of its awakening streets.
Join us for future Skift Ideas podcasts as we speak with the most creative and forward-thinking innovators in travel. As always, go to skift.com to stay up to date on the latest news and insights across the travel industry.